Right, so what I'm going to present today is essentially the fruits of my PhD research that I have been doing over the past couple of years, where I focus specifically on the influence of information structure on OVVO variation. And what I did for this study is I set up a comparative lab, and those of you who see more of my presentations will know this slide, where I looked at OVVO variation in the history of Dutch, German, and English, and tried to answer the question, are these languages the same and divergent because they ended up with a different basic word order, or were these languages different to begin with and even further divergent? So what I will be focusing on today is first how to analyze OVVO variation, because well, there's a lot of opinions on how to do that. And then I'll focus on the common factor in these studies, and that's information structure. And I will develop a unified methodology, and I will present the results of no less than 7 corpus studies. So I'm going to have to talk fast to squeeze that in 25 minutes, and then try to combine all those results together in a unified derivation, while also giving a brief diachronic outlook on how those languages developed from their OVVO period onwards. Okay, so I'm going to start with the history of English, as English is best studied in this regard. And when we look at the literature, and this is by no means intended as an exhaustive list of references, is that you can basically analyze a VVO variation in any possible way. So you can decide on a basic OV word order with optional rightward movement, a basic VO analysis with optional leftward movement, which is what I'm going to argue for as well. Or you can decide to do both with a basic OV, a basic VO, and then have optional rightward and leftward movement whenever that is relevant. When we look at the literature for those other Germanic languages, the picture is just as diverse. So VO in Middle Dutch is considered more liberal extraposition than extraposition in present-day Dutch, but from an OV base. It has been argued that word order is essentially free because there is over the case marking. So objects in post-verbal position escape licensing from an OV base. I have recently argued that you can also analyze Dutch as an antisymmetric VO language, which I'm also going to do later in this talk. For Old Saxon, VO is ambiguous. There is optional heavy MP shift in the low left periphery, and OV is derived by leftward movement. There might be the result of meter, so an increased number of VO objects because the verb likes to be at the end of a metric section. Middle Low German in this regard has not been studied before, but I'm going to present some new data so we can fill that gap. And we see the same picture for Old High German and Middle High German. OV as a result of leftward movement, or VO extraposition from an OV base. So why do another study on OVVO variation if you can just combine the literature and come up with a comparative perspective? Well, each of these studies is associated with its own selection criteria and assumptions about the structural analysis of the language. So that means that you have either a distinction between main and subclauses or not. Sometimes they're lumped together. Clauses with 1 or 2 verbs. Extraposition is sometimes only considered as object DPs, but it also includes PPs in some cases, and in even other cases, even subjects or repositions. So it's sometimes unclear what extraposition is actually, or what authors refer to when they call something extraposition. Sometimes direct or indirect objects are combined, even though they do substantially different things in the clause. And especially in the literature on Dutch, there is a heavy focus on VO objects, but not necessarily on what's going on in OV word order. So my conclusion is that just combining that literature and coming with a conclusion is not necessarily going to work. Then we have one common factor in all of these studies that focus on why that variation is there, because if you look at the motivation for that variation, it might help you come up with a most efficient analysis. And that's information structure. And this is approximately the idea that given information is placed before new information. And then if we extrapolate that to OVVO variation, you come to the conclusion that given objects prefer OV word order, and new objects prefer VO word order. That would be general conclusion. However, again, when you look at all these different studies, you find that they all use different information structure annotation schemes. So we can find given versus new, and then it's not always clear what is counted as given and what is counted as new. So even the given versus new annotation schemes might differ across authors. Focus versus background, and there is an overlap with given versus new, but it is slightly different. Presentational focus versus contrastive focus. Sometimes the article is used as a proxy for information status rather than an actual annotation scheme. So again, not readily comparable or compatible. So that is why I use one unified methodology to study the variation in all of these languages. And what I decided on is that I was going to focus only on subclauses with a finite verb, a non-finite verb, and a direct object. I included subclauses with two verbs only to one, stay away from any possible influences of verb movement, and two, especially in the literature on English, two verb clauses play an important role. So that is why I restricted the data sets to this limited type of clause. No forms of to be, no to infinitives. I excluded indirect objects, pronouns, and quantified and negated objects because those types of objects behave differently. And even with all these exclusions, there is plenty of material left to base conclusions on. What I then did was annotate the objects for length. And this was sort of a control variable to control for the fact that longer objects are more likely to be placed in VO word order than shorter objects. I'm not going to talk about length too much, but that is a factor that keeps popping up even when you talk about information status in and of itself. And I annotated information status on the basis of a simplified version of the pentaset. And the pentaset is essentially 5 categories. One of those categories is inert, and those are non-referential objects, and I will not be talking about those today. I will only be talking about given and new objects, and I've given a couple of present-day English examples here. So given objects are objects that have been mentioned before in one way or another, or that can be inferred from something that has been mentioned before or something that is in the immediate surroundings. So we have an example of an identity. So cats deliver more eye-narrowing movements when their owners slow blink at them than when the owners did not deliver the stimulus. So the slow blinking stimulus has been mentioned plenty of times before in the preceding discourse. We have an elaborating inferred relationship. So you have the agreement. You can infer the existence of the agreement from the existence of terms. So once you have terms, you also have an agreement. And in the case of assumed objects, these are world knowledge, encyclopedic knowledge. So when you have a sentence, and he could read the stars, you don't have to introduce the stars as a new discourse referent because we all know what you are referring to. Discourse new objects are objects that are entirely new in the discourse. So I just ate a delicious pancake. You have no clue of what I just ate. So this is really a new object in this discourse. But I also considered in bridging inferables cases of new objects. So in the case of bridging inferables, there is also a relationship between something that has been mentioned before, but the existence of that particular referent doesn't directly follow from the existence of the antecedent. So in the case he did not want to sell him his vineyard, and we have his vineyard is linked by the he by means of that possessive pronoun, but just because that person exists doesn't mean that that vineyard also immediately exists, because not everyone owns a vineyard. Then when we look at the results, I divided them for Old English and early Middle English. And what I find here is that given objects freely occur in OV word order, although not obligatory. But what's most important is that new objects seem to be barred from OV word order. So there's a handful of examples in my Old English data set, but there is no new object in pre-verbal word order whatsoever. And what you see in early Middle English is that there is a slight decline of OV word order, but given objects still appear in OV position in more than 50% of the time. So given objects occur freely in OV word order, whereas new objects strongly prefer VO. Now, when we look at Old Saxon and Middle Low German, we find a picture that is different. So what we find here is that it is the new objects that seem to, that can be placed rather freely in either OV or VO word order. So we see a strong preference or a strong preference for given objects to be OV, whereas new objects can readily appear in VO word order. And given objects just prefer VO. So this is an example of where length plays a role as well. So a very heavy given objects can also be found in a post-verbal word order. And well, those Middle Low German data are new. They are from the recently released Corpus of Historical Low German. And when we look at the results for High German, we find a similar picture to that of Low German, except in Old High German, but the number of examples is quite low because there weren't that many clauses with two verbs in the reference corpus out Deutsch. But we see a strong preference for OV word order there as well, but new objects I don't find new objects as frequently in VO word order. But when we get to Middle High German, we see that it is new objects that appear rather freely in VO word order as opposed to those given objects. Then finally, the results for Dutch. So there is no material available for Old Dutch, so I can only present data from Middle Dutch, unfortunately. I would love to know what's going on in earlier stages of Dutch. And again, we see a similar picture to that of German. Given objects prefer OV word order, whereas new objects rather freely appear in VO word order. So if we sum this up, we find that information structure influences object position in all languages. So those effects were significant for all those languages, but the direction in which this happens is different. So when you have the OV-VO continuum here, we find that English seems to be influenced in the direction of OV by givenness, whereas for Dutch and German, it is newness that seems to influence in the direction of VO. So what you might conclude from this is that basic, and I say that between, or in the carefulest way possible, that basic distinction between OV, VO is already present in the earlier language stages. And then what happens is that information structure effect disappears and we arrive at a strict word order. So moving on to the derivation. And I'm going to start with Old and Middle English word order again. So the results that I present for English seems to suggest that the variation in the history of English can be analyzed from a VO base, and I'm not the only one who has proposed this. And my specific analysis that I developed together with Ans is based on the Bieberauer and Roberts 2005 analysis. And we assume here that there is optional pipe piping or DP movement of the object to a lower spec little VP, so in a biclausal derivation. And that object is attracted by a picky EPP or edge feature, if you will. And this feature only attracts big DP. So these are objects that have an additional phi-related feature. So they're bigger than non-given objects. And that additional feature layer helps to signal the referentiality of the object. So there is no direct information structure syntax relationship. It is really by means of the features of the objects that information structure plays a role within the syntax. And that means that only given objects undergo movement, which results in OV. And then secondly, I assume optional piping of that lower clause under the influence of the object or the clause to the specifier of the higher little VP, which I assume is a strategy to defocus the entire clause. I'm working on this with Chiara Bastiani, and this has also been proposed by Tanya Milichev. And this is what results in a verb auxiliary word order. This approach is phase-based, so an object must move to the specifier of a little VP in order to be raised to the specifier of the higher little VP. Any object that's not raised, so new objects, will be spelled out in VO position as a result of the phase impenetrability condition. So how does that work? This is a clause in which no information structural related movements take place. So we have an auxiliary in the higher little VP and the verb in the lower little VP, and then we have the object donation and engel in the basic position as the complement of that big VP. When you move the object or you pipe the VP, it will result in auxiliary object verb word order. And if you move the object to the highest position, so to the higher little VP, you get object auxiliary verb word order. And I argue that this is an exceptional extra movement step that you have to make. Then object verb auxiliary clauses, you have to roll up the clause in this case. So you first have to move the object to the specifier of little VP, and then the entire TP is fronted to the little VP in the higher on the higher cycle. So here is that movement of the VP to the specifier of little VP, and then you drag that TP to the specifier of a little VP in the matrix clause, and you end up with the verb above the auxiliary. In the case of verb auxiliary object word orders, I assume that the object fails to raise to the specifier of the embedded little VP, and because it's not in the edge of the phase, it will be spelled out in a post-verbal position. So in this case, that VP with the object is spelled out, and then the rest of the clause is constructed, and it ends up in post-verbal position. So because the word orders are similar in Dutch and German, you might say, well, just assume this analysis for Dutch and German as well, but there are a couple of differences that I would like to point out that have to be accounted for as well. So when we look at auxiliary object verb word order and object auxiliary verb word order, we find a couple of striking differences. So in Old English and Middle English, auxiliary object verb word order is very frequent. It's one of the most frequently used constructions, whereas object auxiliary verb word order is only around 5% of the examples. So that's really a minority pattern. And when we look at the history of German, and I'm lumping together Low German and High German here because they behave similarly in this regard, we find that in the earliest stages, auxiliary object verb word order is fairly frequent, and object auxiliary verb word order is a minority. But as these languages develop, auxiliary object verb word order becomes infrequent, whereas object auxiliary verb word order becomes much more frequent. In Middle Dutch, no examples, well, a handful of auxiliary object verb word order, but a very frequent object auxiliary verb word order. So what this suggests is that in two verb clauses, there might be an incipient trend towards transparency effects that we also observe in present-day Dutch and German, but not in English. So what I would like to propose is, first of all, that the EPP feature is not as selective as in Old and Middle English. I assumed that that feature was picky. It could only attract objects that have an additional feature layer. And I assume here that it attracts all objects, and that will result in obligatory OV word order. The same as with English, it can be satisfied by optional piping. And I assume that the variation in object position, so the information structure effect, is the result of differential spellouts of copies of the object as they move along in the tree. So in English, there is a more direct syntactic reflex of that information structure effect than there is in Dutch and German. And then what I would like to propose is that the little VP loses the possibility to license the object, so the lower little VP. So I assumed that that EPP feature was on the lower little VP for English, and I argue that it shifts to the higher little VP, and that is what's create the transparency effects. So to see how that works, we have an example from Dutch here. So dat wij zouden beschamen die wijze deze wereld. An object in its base position. However, I do assume that it has moved through the little VP on the lower cycle to the little VP on the higher cycle, but that it is spelled out on, that the lowest copy is spelled out in its base position. In the case of object-verb auxiliary word order, so complete roll-up of the clause, the object moves to the specifier of the lower little VP in the embedded clause, but it cannot satisfy the feature there, so it has to move into the main clause as well. And as a consequence, it drags the verb with it. So we get object-verb auxiliary word order. And then we have object auxiliary verb word order, and that is movement of the object into the higher little VP. Well, I have to assume movement through little VP on the embedded clause as well. I did not draw that here, but I do assume it. And you can do either pipe piping or just object movement. Verb auxiliary object word orders are a bit tricky in this regard. We can again assume a low spell out, and we saw in the previous talk that might be because you want to keep the information stream as convenient as possible. And the effect of length in these cases is very strong. So there is a difference between auxiliary verb object word orders and verb auxiliary object word orders in terms of length. So verb auxiliary object word orders are much heavier. So the objects are much heavier in this case. The example here is Antonis Infroot, Portrait der Versailles Steden. That's already quite a heavy object, but this is one of the shorter ones that I selected so that it would fit on the slide. Sometimes these objects can go on for 2, 3, 4 lines. So that might be the reason why they are lined up at the end of the clause. Then finally, the diachronic development. English is moving towards no movement. The information structural trigger for verb auxiliary word order is lost first. You end up with a strict auxiliary verb word order. And the DP objects lose their additional feature layer, which might be related to the grammaticalization of the determiner. And that results in strict VO word order. And Dutch and German move towards obligatory movement into the higher clause. So the EPP feature attracts all objects. Licensing of objects becomes strictly local, so you can no longer spell out a lower object. And objects must be licensed in a position above the finite verb, which results in transparency effects and also strict OV word order. And I assume here that pipe piping remains possible. This creates the verb auxiliary verb alternation that we still observe, especially in Dutch, but which is without apparent semantic or pragmatic effect, which is what you would expect if it's the result of movement that is caused by the object and not by something else. So to come back to my comparative lab and the questions, are these languages the same and divergent, or are these languages different and divergent? I don't think I can give a full answer to either of those questions. So yes, they are different, but they also have a lot of similarities in that they are triggered, or that the variation is triggered by a same factor, but in a different way. And then as a consequence, they are even further divergent. Thank you.